The starving stranger. The marketplace was long abandoned, its once busy corridors now silent and filled with shadows of a time when merchants traded across the stars. Rusted signs hung loosely from broken stalls, cracked glass revealed empty shelves, and only the hum of the wind passed through the ruins. It was here, on the very edge of human space, that she staggered forward, her steps weak and her body trembling. Her name was lost to those who had once called her princess, but in her heart she still carried that burden even as hunger clawed at her stomach. She had not eaten in days, and her vision blurred until shapes blended into one another. Her thin arms clutched at her middle as she stumbled past the shattered remnants of the outpost. Each breath came shallow, ragged, and her throat burned from thirst. Pride had kept her alive this long. The memory of her people whispering that she must not bow, yet pride could not fill her stomach. She had wandered from world to world after betrayal and exile, but nowhere had she found refuge, and now her legs gave way as she sank against the cold steel of a collapsed wall. She thought that this would be her last resting place. It was then that a voice called out, small and filled with curiosity. A human child no older than 7 had spotted her while exploring the ruins. His wide eyes looked at her strange features, the shimmer of her alien skin and the faint glow in her eyes that still carried the royal mark of her bloodline. He did not run away, nor cry out in fear as she expected. Instead, he stepped closer, holding a half-broken toy in his hand, and tilted his head with the simple innocence only a child could possess. The princess tried to wave him away, whispering with what little strength she had left that he should not come near, but her words were barely sound. The boy only frowned as if scolding her silence. He saw the way her body shook, the way she looked like a bird with broken wings, and in his young heart he understood something was terribly wrong. Without hesitation, he turned and ran back through the ruins, calling out for his father. The father, a man hardened by life on the frontier, came quickly with caution in his eyes. He had taught his son never to approach strangers, especially not in these empty places where danger could hide in every shadow. Yet when he saw the alien woman slumped against the wall, half conscious and pale from starvation, his first instinct was to reach for his weapon. Humans had learned long ago to distrust what came from beyond the stars, but before he could speak or act, the child tugged at his sleeve and pointed at the woman. His voice was loud and filled with an odd determination as he shouted the words that stunned his father. He said if she wanted food, then she must become his mother, and the only way was for his father to marry her. The child's reasoning was pure and unshaken, for in his world the bond of family meant safety and meals shared at the table, and he believed this alien stranger deserved that chance. The father blinked, caught between laughter and disbelief, but when his eyes fell on the woman again, he saw her lips moving without sound, begging though she had no strength to speak. He looked back at his son, whose eyes were filled not with childish play but with a plea that only innocence could give. The man sighed, knowing the boy's heart could not be ignored. He crouched down, lifted the frail woman into his arms, and carried her back toward their home on the edge of the settlement. The alien princess felt warmth for the first time in weeks. Her body was cradled against human strength, and though her pride told her she should resist, her hunger told her to yield. The boy walked beside them with a smile as if his plan had already succeeded. The father said nothing, his thoughts heavy with questions, but he did not turn away. Thus began a strange journey, sparked by a child's bold words spoken in a forgotten ruin, words that would bind destinies together and change the fate of more than one world. The meal in the promise. The small house on the edge of the settlement was built of stone and timber, with the smell of smoke drifting from its chimney and the faint light of fire flickering against the walls inside. The father laid the alien woman carefully on a wooden bench near the fire, while the child hurried to fetch water and bread. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths as if each one might be her last, yet her eyes fluttered open and she gazed upon the place with confusion. She had expected to die among ruins, but now she found herself inside a human home, surrounded by warmth and the sound of voices. The father brought a bowl of stew that had been simmering for hours and lifted a spoon to her lips. She trembled as the first taste touched her tongue, rich with meat and herbs, a flavor so overwhelming that tears filled her eyes. She had forgotten what it meant to eat until that moment. Bite by bite, he fed her slowly, careful not to overwhelm her weakened body, while the child watched proudly as though his demand had already been fulfilled. The alien princess whispered faint thanks, her voice hoarse but filled with sincerity. When strength returned enough for her to sit upright, she looked at the child, who smiled brightly at her and called her mother without hesitation. She blinked in surprise, unsure how to respond, for never in her life had she been called by such a name. She had been called royalty, commander, exile, traitor, but never mother. The word stirred something deep inside her heart, something she thought had died when her own people betrayed her. The father frowned at his son's boldness, yet did not correct him, for part of him felt there was truth hidden within the boy's innocent words. As the fire crackled, she began to speak in broken phrases about her past. She told them she had once lived among stars on a world far richer than this one, a place of shining towers and endless feasts. Yet greed and betrayal had torn it from her. She was cast out when rivals sought to claim her throne, and ever since she had been hunted, forced to flee from system to system until her body weakened and her will faltered. The father listened in silence, his face stern but not cruel, while the child's eyes widened with awe at the idea that this weary woman was once a princess. The father considered her words with caution, for he had lived long enough to know that titles often carried danger. Still, when he looked at her, he saw not a threat but a soul who had been beaten down and left to die. He remembered the bold words of his son, and wondered if perhaps fate had chosen this path for them. He offered her a blanket and promised she could stay at least until she regained her strength, though his voice was firm that their home was simple and their food scarce. She nodded with gratitude, for even the smallest kindness felt like salvation after her long suffering. Days passed slowly as she recovered. The child clung to her side, bringing her flowers from the hills and showing her the small treasures he collected from the settlement. He told her stories of his late mother, whom he barely remembered, and explained in his own way that he did not want his father to remain alone. Each word chipped away at the walls she had built around her heart. The father watched this bond form with quiet unease, but also with a spark of hope he had not felt in years. At night, as the stars stretched across the sky, she lay awake on her cot and thought about the strange twist of fate that had placed her here. She remembered the cold corridors of her palace and the hunger of exile. Yet now she was given warmth and food by people who owed her nothing. She wondered if she could ever repay them, or if repayment was even possible. Her pride told her to resist the pull of these humans, but her heart whispered that perhaps this was the place she had been searching for since her fall. The father knew danger might follow her, yet he also knew that turning her away now would betray the lesson he had always tried to teach his son. That strength meant more than weapons. It meant compassion when others had none. And so, though he did not say the words aloud, he made a promise to himself that as long as she stayed under his roof, he would protect her. He did not yet understand the storm that would soon arrive, but for now the fire burned bright, the stew filled their bowls, and the fragile threads of family began to weave between them. Whispers of pursuers. Days stretched into weeks, and the alien princess found herself growing stronger, in body and in spirit, as she lived within the small home on the edge of the settlement. She helped with simple tasks such as grinding herbs, mending torn clothing, and carrying water from the well, though her hands had once been adorned with jewels and had never touched such work before. The child never left her side and often declared proudly to the other children of the settlement that his new mother was a princess from the stars. At first the others laughed at his wild claim, but when they saw the strange shimmer of her skin and the glow in her eyes, they began to wonder if he spoke truth after all. The father kept his watchful eye on the skies, for he had lived long enough on the frontier to know that nothing remained hidden forever. His instincts sharpened when traders passing through the region began whispering of unfamiliar ships that had been seen drifting in orbit, ships that did not belong to the human colonies and whose markings were unknown. Some said they were raiders, others claimed they were mercenaries, but all agreed they were searching for someone. The father did not speak of it to his son, but when he looked at the alien woman, he knew the answer that none dared voice aloud. One evening, when the sun had fallen and the stars gleamed above, the princess stood outside wrapped in a cloak against the night air. She stared upward with haunted eyes as if waiting for the sky itself to betray her. The father approached quietly and asked her what she was seeking in the heavens. For a moment she remained silent, but at last she admitted the truth that she had hoped to keep buried. She told him that her enemies hunted her still, and would not rest until she was captured or dead. They had sent mercenaries to chase her across systems, and if they had found this world, then it meant danger was closer than either of them wished to believe. The father clenched his fists as memories of war returned to him. He had once worn a uniform and carried a rifle in distant battles, where human soldiers fought tooth and nail against enemies who underestimated them. He had hoped those days were gone, yet now he saw that his son's innocent wish had drawn them back into the fire. He looked at the princess and saw fear in her eyes. Not fear for herself alone, but fear for the child who had given her hope. She confessed that she could not bear the thought of her pursuers harming him or his father, because of her presence. She even spoke of leaving before they could be found, but the father shook his head and told her that leaving would not erase the danger. If they had tracked her this far, then they would burn the earth itself to claim their prize. The child overheard fragments of their words and ran to her side with tears in his eyes. He clutched at her hand and begged her not to leave, declaring loudly that she was his mother and that no one had the right to take her away. His voice trembled, but his will was firm, and in that moment the princess felt her heart break and heal at the same time. She knelt down and embraced him, whispering that she would never abandon him no matter what storm approached. From that night forward, the family lived beneath the shadow of approaching danger. The father began repairing old weapons he had hidden away and strengthened the defenses of their home. He taught his son how to stay silent and where to hide should strangers arrive. The princess too began to prepare herself, practicing the old combat forms of her people, though hunger and exile had left her weak. She knew she could not stand alone, but together with these humans she might yet find strength. The whispers grew louder as more traders spoke of patrols in the skies and strange questions being asked at every port. The settlement grew uneasy, though few knew the true cause. The father kept his silence, but his eyes remained sharp, and the princess carried within her the heavy truth that the hunters were near. She could feel the weight of destiny pressing closer with each sunrise. What had begun as a desperate plea for food and shelter was now turning into a battle for survival. And in the quiet moments before dawn, she wondered if the bold words of a human child had bound her fate not only to his family, but to the destiny of humanity itself. The hunters arrived. Morning began like any other, with the faint glow of the rising sun, casting long shadows over the hills and the quiet sound of birds waking in the trees. The child ran outside to chase after the animals near the edge of the field, while the father worked to split wood for the fire, and the princess prepared bread inside the small home. Yet there was a tension in the air that none could ignore, a silence that seemed to press against the walls of the world. The father felt it in his bones before he heard the sound, the distant rumble that did not belong to thunder or storm but to engines cutting through the atmosphere. The child froze and looked up with wide eyes as dark shapes pierced the sky. The father dropped the axe and pulled his son back inside with urgency, while the princess clutched the edge of the table, her heart pounding because she knew exactly who had come. The hunters had found her at last. The sound grew louder as ships descended, sleek and armored with markings of mercenary clans known across the stars. Dust and wind whipped through the settlement as they landed near the outskirts, their heavy forms towering over the homes like steel giants. Doors opened with a hiss, and armored figures stepped onto the ground. They were tall and broad, with helmets that concealed their faces and weapons that glowed with alien power. The settlers cowered in fear as the hunters marched forward in formation, their leader's voice booming as he demanded the surrender of the fugitive princess. His words carried the cold authority of one who had tracked her across countless worlds and would not leave without her. The father placed himself between the princess and the door, his rifle in hand, though it was old and scarred from past wars. He told his son to hide in the cellar and not to come out until he called. The child protested with tears burning in his eyes, but obeyed when his father's voice grew stern. The princess stood trembling, but not from weakness, rather from the knowledge that her presence had brought this doom upon them. She wanted to step forward and give herself up, if only to save the humans who had given her kindness. Yet the father blocked her path with a look that silenced her words. He told her firmly that no guest under his roof would be handed over like a piece of prey. The mercenaries advanced, their leader lifting a weapon to show he would not wait long. The father raised his rifle, and for a moment the world held its breath. The child peeked from the cellar door and saw his father standing tall with the alien princess behind him, and in that image he saw courage greater than any story he had ever imagined. The hunters sneered, expecting the human to fall quickly, but they did not yet understand the nature of those they faced. The first shot rang out and chaos followed. The father's rifle cracked like thunder, and one of the mercenaries fell to the dirt with armor pierced. The others roared and returned fire, beams of energy tearing into the ground and splintering wood. The princess pulled the child deeper into safety while the father moved with practiced skill, using cover and striking back with precision. He was outnumbered, but his movements carried the memory of battlefields long past. The princess could not remain idle. She seized a blade kept near the hearth and moved to his side, her royal training in combat returning with each strike. Together they fought, one with the cunning of a soldier hardened by hardship and the other with the grace of a warrior born to lead. The settlers who watched could scarcely believe their eyes as two souls from different worlds stood together against an enemy that seemed invincible. The battle did not end in victory, but in survival. The mercenaries withdrew temporarily, dragging away their wounded while vowing to return with greater force. The ground was scorched, the home damaged, and fear clung to the air like smoke. Yet the family remained standing, their bond now sealed by fire and blood. The child rushed from the cellar to embrace them both, tears streaming as he cried that they were his mother and father, and that no enemy would ever take them from him. The princess held him close, her heart breaking with both sorrow and pride. She had been hunted across the stars and had known only betrayal. But here in the arms of a human child, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt belonging. And she knew the hunters had not only found her, they had awakened something within humanity that the galaxy was not prepared to face. The escape and the confession. Night after the battle hung heavy over the settlement, as smoke still rose from the ground where energy blasts had torn the soil apart. The settlers whispered in fear and gathered their belongings, uncertain if more enemies would descend upon them. Inside the small home, the father cleaned his rifle with steady hands, though his face carried the weight of worry. The princess sat near the fire with her head bowed while the child clung to her side, refusing to let her go even for a moment. Though they had survived the first clash, both adults knew the mercenaries would return in greater numbers, and that staying here meant death for everyone. Before dawn, the father made his choice. He packed what little food and supplies they could carry, strapped the rifle across his back, and told his son they must leave at once. The child asked where they were going, and the father answered only that anywhere beyond the reach of the hunters would do. The princess hesitated, torn between the desire to stay and the guilt that their lives were endangered because of her. She tried once more to speak of surrender, but the father silenced her with a firm look and reminded her that family was not something abandoned in the face of fear. His voice carried such certainty that she found herself unable to argue further. They slipped into the forest that stretched across the hills, moving quietly under cover of darkness. The child grew tired, but the princess lifted him into her arms, carrying him with a strength she thought she had lost. The father led them along hidden paths known only to hunters and soldiers, places he had once used when avoiding patrols in wars long past. Night was filled with the sound of insects and distant howls, but none of it frightened them as much as the thought of armored boots following close behind. As they rested near a stream, the princess looked upon the father and knew the time for truth had come. She could no longer allow them to risk everything without understanding who she truly was. She told him that she had not simply been a noble cast aside, but the rightful heir to a throne that controlled fleets and worlds. She explained that her cousins had plotted against her, accusing her of weakness, and had paid mercenaries to hunt her until she vanished. Her survival threatened their claim, and so they would never stop until her life was ended. She lowered her gaze as she admitted that bringing this storm upon his family had never been her intent. The father listened in silence, his eyes reflecting the firelight of their small camp. When she finished, he simply nodded, for he had already suspected that her secret carried great weight. He told her that the truth changed little in his heart, because he had already seen who she truly was when she cared for his son and fought beside him in their home. He reminded her that titles could not cook a meal or comfort a child, but her presence had done both. His words struck her deeper than any blade, breaking down the walls she had carried since exile. The child stirred from sleep and whispered that he did not care if she was a princess or a queen. She was his mother, and that was enough. Tears touched her eyes as she embraced him, and in that moment she realized that the bond formed by his bold demand was stronger than any crown she had once worn. Their journey continued through valleys and ridges as the stars shifted overhead. Each step carried them farther from the settlement, but not beyond the reach of the mercenaries who hunted them. The father began to speak of calling upon old comrades who had fought with him in the past, men and women who had once sworn oaths to defend humanity with their lives. The princess listened carefully and for the first time began to believe that these humans could stand against the forces that pursued her. She had seen their courage in a single household, but she now wondered what such courage would look like if united across a world. By the time dawn painted the sky in shades of red and gold, they had crossed into the mountains where caves offered shelter. The father lit a small fire, and the princess leaned against the stone wall with the child asleep in her lap. Her mind raced with thoughts of destiny and fear, yet beneath it all she felt a new strength rising. She had once believed her throne defined her, but now she saw that perhaps fate had led her here for another purpose. She was not only a princess in exile anymore, she was a mother by the will of a child and a partner in survival beside a human soldier, and she knew the hunters who came next would discover a strength they had never imagined. Humanity's hidden strength, the mountains stretched wide and endless with jagged cliffs that cut into the clouds and valleys that sank into darkness, like the mouths of sleeping beasts. It was here among the caves and winding paths that the father led his small family, moving with the caution of a man who had survived more wars than he cared to count. The princess walked beside him, her eyes scanning the skies for any sign of hunters while the child clung to her hand and asked when they would be safe. The father did not give easy answers, for he knew safety was a luxury that could no longer be promised. At night they rested in caverns lit by the glow of fire and the soft shimmer of alien plants that grew along the rocks. The child would fall asleep in the princess's arms and she would stare into the flames with thoughts that spiraled between fear and hope. The father remained awake for long hours, sharpening blades, cleaning his rifle, and speaking quietly into a small transmitter he had kept hidden for years. The princess soon realized he was not only leading them to escape, but reaching out across the scattered colonies for men and women he once called comrades. Days later, the first of them arrived. A scarred veteran with one arm replaced by steel walked into the cave carrying a heavy pack of supplies. He clasped the father's hand without a word, the bond of old soldiers stronger than speech. Soon after came others, each different in shape and story but bound by the same thread of humanity's hard spirit. There was a sharpshooter with eyes that missed nothing, a medic who had carried wounded through fire, a woman whose laughter masked the memory of battlefields soaked in blood. They came not for gold or glory, but because the father had called, and that was reason enough. The princess watched them with wonder. She had grown among warriors of her own kind, trained and armored, yet these humans carried something different in their bearing. They had suffered much, but their resolve was like iron. They spoke in rough voices, argued over details, and laughed even in hunger. But beneath it all she saw the spark of a people who refused to yield. Her heart stirred as she realized the hunters who sought her had no understanding of what they would face. The group trained in the valleys and forests, moving like shadows, setting traps, testing weapons, and drilling the child to hide in ways that even he began to treat as a game. The princess joined them, her royal combat forms blending with human tactics until she felt herself become something new. Neither the pampered heir she once was nor the starving exile she had become, but a fighter shaped by both worlds. The father guided her hand when she held a rifle, correcting her stance, and she taught him how to wield a blade with speed and precision. Each lesson drew them closer, their trust deepening with every exchange. The mercenaries above continued their search, circling with ships that blotted out the stars, but they underestimated the humans hiding below. They believed Earth's frontier to be weak, a place of scattered farmers and settlers, but they did not see the veterans who had survived wars that should have broken them. Around the fire one night, the medic told stories of battles where human soldiers had fought until their last breath, holding lines against foes who outnumbered them 10-1. The princess listened in silence, her chest tightening as she began to understand that humanity's strength was not measured in fleets or thrones, but in the unbreakable will to fight for family and survival. The child, too, grew into this new life. He followed the veterans, asking questions and carrying supplies, declaring proudly that his mother and father would defeat any who came for them. His innocence mixed with courage gave hope to those who had grown weary of conflict, reminding them why they fought in the first place. The princess often caught herself staring at him and wondering if his bold demand had been more than the whim of a child, if perhaps it had been the spark of destiny itself. As the hunters prepared to strike again, the humans were ready. Hidden weapons lay buried in the hills. Traps lined the mountain passes, and signals had been sent to outlying settlements. The father stood with his comrades, the princess at his side, and the child clinging to her hand, and in that moment she knew she belonged to them as much as they belonged to her. The hunters had come to claim a fugitive princess, but what they would find instead was a family bound together by fire, and a people whose hidden strength would shake the stars. The battle for a new future, the sky burned with the fire of descending ships as the mercenaries returned in numbers greater than before. Their engines roared like storms, and their shadows stretched across the mountains as though the heavens themselves had opened in anger. The people of the settlement who had fled now watched from afar, praying the humans in the hills would stand, though few believed it possible. The princess felt her heart pound as she saw the enemy march across the valley floor, a tide of armored figures advancing with weapons glowing bright. She knew they had come for her, but as she looked at the father, at the child, and at the veterans gathered in the caves, she understood that surrender was no longer an option. The father stood tall at the front of the group, his rifle steady in his hands, his face carved from stone by years of war. Around him the veterans prepared their traps, checked their weapons, and murmured to each other with grim smiles. They did not fear the numbers before them, for they had lived too long with the knowledge that fear brought only defeat. The princess took her place beside them, her blade in hand, her heart no longer burdened by shame but filled with purpose. The child clung to her cloak, yet his eyes shone with the same determination that had carried her into this family. When the first wave of mercenaries entered the pass, the hills erupted. Explosives hidden beneath rocks burst into flame, collapsing paths and scattering the enemy into confusion. From the ridges, the sharpshooter unleashed his fire, each shot finding a mark and cutting down armored foes before they could regroup. The father led the charge from the ground, his rifle blazing as he moved with the precision of a soldier who had never forgotten the lessons of war. The princess followed close, her blade flashing in arcs of light as she cut through enemies who underestimated her strength. The mercenaries answered with fury, unleashing volleys of energy that scorched the earth and shattered stone. Yet the humans moved with relentless coordination, striking and vanishing, drawing the enemy deeper into traps that closed around them like jaws. The medic pulled the wounded back to safety, while the others pressed forward with fire and steel. The hunters had believed they were chasing prey, but they now realized too late that they had walked into the den of predators. The battle raged through the day, echoing across the mountains like thunder. The princess fought with all the skill of her royal training, yet she found herself inspired by the ferocity of the humans around her. They did not fight for thrones or titles, they fought for one another, and that made them unstoppable. The child, hidden deep within the caves, whispered prayers for his parents, and dreamed of the day this would all be over. At last, the leader of the mercenaries stepped forward, towering above the battlefield with armor that gleamed dark as night. His voice boomed across the valley as he demanded the princess surrender, promising to spare the humans if she obeyed. She stepped forward, her blade ready, but before she could answer, the father raised his rifle and declared that no one in his family would ever be handed over. His words cut through the roar of battle, and for the first time the mercenary leader faltered. What followed was a duel of wills as much as weapons. The father fought with raw strength and unyielding determination. The princess struck with the grace of her heritage, and together they brought down the leader in a storm of fire and steel. When he fell, the mercenaries broke, their ranks scattering into retreat, their ships lifting from the ground and fleeing back into the stars. The mountains grew silent once more except for the cries of victory that rose from human throats. The princess stood amid the wreckage with the father at her side, and the child running to embrace them both. She held him close, her eyes filled with tears as she realized the words he had once spoken in innocence had become truth. She was no longer a fugitive wandering the stars. She was part of a family bound by love and courage. The father placed his hand upon hers, and together they looked toward the horizon where dawn broke once again. The galaxy would one day learn of what had happened in these mountains, how mercenaries who hunted royalty had been crushed by a handful of humans who refused to bow. Whispers would spread of humanity's hidden strength, of a people who fought not with fleets but with hearts that never surrendered. And the princess knew that when the time came she would no longer stand alone, for she had found her home among those who had saved her with food, with shelter, and with love. The child smiled up at them, his voice clear and certain as he repeated the words that had begun it all. He called her his mother, and declared once more that she belonged with them. She kissed his forehead, and whispered that he was right. And, in that simple moment, she felt a peace she had never known before. The stars above glittered like jewels against the dark, and for the first time she looked upon them not with fear, but with hope. The hunters had failed, the family had endured, and a new future had begun not only for her, but for all of humanity. The battle for a new future. The morning came with the roar of engines shaking the sky as ships descended in fire and smoke, and the mountains trembled beneath their weight. The hunters had returned in numbers far greater than before, and the ground seemed to quake beneath the march of armored boots. The child clutched the princess's hand and whispered in fear, but she held him close and promised in her heart that she would never let them take him. The father stood before the gathering of his comrades, his rifle steady and his eyes filled with the resolve of a man who had lived through too many wars to be afraid now. The mercenaries advanced into the valley, certain of their victory, but the hills answered with thunder. Explosives tore the ground apart, and fire consumed the first wave as the veterans unleashed their fury. From the ridges, rifles cracked, and each shot struck true. While below, the father led his people into the fight with calm precision. The princess moved at his side, her blade a streak of light that cut down those who dared to reach them. For the first time, she felt not like an exile, but like a warrior with purpose, fighting not for a throne, but for the family that had given her new life. The battle raged across the mountain passes. Mercenaries fired beams of energy that scorched the stone, but the humans struck with tactics born of hardship, luring them into traps and ambushes, striking fast and vanishing again. The hunters had believed they were chasing weak prey, but they now saw with horror that they had awakened predators whose spirit could not be broken. The veterans laughed even as fire rained around them, their courage burning brighter than the flames of war. At last, the leader of the mercenaries strode forward, clad in dark armor that glowed with alien power. His voice boomed across the battlefield as he demanded the princess surrender or see the humans slaughtered. She stepped forward, her blade raised, ready to give her life to end the struggle, but the father stopped her and lifted his rifle. He declared that no one would ever take his family while he still breathed. His words carried across the valley, like a banner of defiance, and the mercenary leader hesitated as if struck by a force stronger than any weapon. The clash that followed shook the earth. The father fought with unyielding strength. The princess struck with the grace of her birthright, and together they overcame the armored giant. When he fell, the mercenaries lost their will, their ranks shattered, and their ships fled back into the heavens. Silence followed, broken only by the cries of victory from the humans who had stood against the impossible and triumphed. The princess fell to her knees with the child rushing into her arms, and the father standing beside them with quiet pride. She looked at them and understood that the bold words spoken by a child had shaped her destiny. She was no longer a fugitive hiding from the galaxy. She was mother to a boy who had chosen her, partner to a man who had defended her, and daughter, now to a world that had given her hope when she had none left. They stood together at the edge of the mountain and watched as the dawn spread golden light across the land. The galaxy would one day learn of this battle, how mercenaries who chased a fallen princess had been defeated not by fleets or empires, but by a handful of humans whose hearts knew no fear. Whispers would spread of humanity's hidden power and their refusal to ever bow. And when that day came, the galaxy would tremble in awe and fear. The child smiled up at them both and repeated the words that had begun everything, that she was his mother and belonged with them forever. She kissed his forehead with tears in her eyes and whispered that he had been right all along. She turned her gaze to the stars above, and for the first time she saw not exile and danger, but home and hope. The end.